Hello students, and welcome to Political Science 1513.W1. In this video, we're going to spend some time talking about how early colonial experiences helped to set the stage for the American Revolution, yes, but also how these experiences helped us to develop some of the core beliefs, values, and principles that would ultimately appear in our Constitution, and therefore that continue to shape our system of government and politics in the United States all the way up to the present day. So, let's begin this lecture by going over some of our learning objectives. Learning objective number 1. Explain how early colonial experiences helped to develop some of the core political beliefs, values, and traditions still present in American politics today. Learning objective number 2. Trace the events and grievances that helped lead to the American Revolution. Learning objective number 3. Explain how the perceived weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation helped lead to the birth of our Constitution. Finally, we will close this week's lecture with learning objective number 4, where I ask for you to detail the key factions, proposals, and compromises of the Constitutional Convention that would ultimately take place in Philadelphia. Let's begin by talking about learning objective number 1. And to do that, we need to go all the way back to the year 1607, when we have the founding of Jamestown. Jamestown was the first sort of permanent British settlement on the North American continent. But I do want you to understand a few things about Jamestown. First, Jamestown was never intended to be the seed of what would grow into a country. Instead, Jamestown was meant to serve as a sort of trading post. It was meant to help make money for two groups of people. First, we have the British government, and second, we have a private group called the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company was a London-based group of entrepreneurs, and it basically wanted to send a group of employees over to the North American continent so that they can begin exploiting that continent for resources that were readily available here in the Western Hemisphere, but that at that time were quite rare and therefore very valuable over in Europe. The problem for the Virginia Company is that at this time, transporting a group of people all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and then compensating them sufficiently to convince them to stay across the Atlantic Ocean for any prolonged period of time was very expensive. And they just did not have sufficient revenue to foot that bill, even if they would eventually see a return on their investment. So they needed an initial investment to cover the initial costs of settling in the Chesapeake Bay area that today we refer to as Virginia. So what did they do? Well, they turned to the British government and they entered into a contract with the Crown, where the Crown agreed to foot the bill of initial expenses in exchange for an agreement from the Virginia Company that all of the goods they harvested over in the North American continent would be brought back to London and sold where it could be taxed by the Crown. So the London Company wants to exploit resources, and the British Crown wants to tax that exploitation. And this works out pretty well. But the reason this contract between the Virginia Company and the British Crown is so important for our purposes is that it helps explain how Jamestown helped us to begin developing our custom of local sovereignty. How does it do this? Well, in the contract, we're going to find that the British Crown gave the Virginia Company, and I quote, full power and authority, end quote, to make all of the laws governing day-to-day life in Jamestown. So, if you don't know, this is a form of local sovereignty. Sovereignty is the power and authority to make all laws governing day-to-day life in a certain area. And the British Crown has essentially handed that over to the Virginia Company for the purpose of settling in Jamestown. And what that means is that the settlers in Jamestown are becoming accustomed to running their own business. They remain British subjects, but they're not following the same day-to-day rules or paying the same day-to-day taxes that British subjects in other parts of the empire would have been paying. Instead, if they do pay any taxes, if they do follow any rules, these are rules that they have created locally. But we're not done yet, because Jamestown is also where we begin to develop our belief in representative or democratic government, and where we begin to learn to practice democratic problem solving. Because the Virginia Company decides to exercise this local sovereignty, this full power and authority to make its own laws, in a really interesting way. Instead of simply appointing a boss or a governor to run things in Jamestown, they decide that they will let the settlers in Jamestown elect assembly persons from among their own number to govern representatively. So what we start to see is that we've got representative government, where individuals will choose other individuals from among their own numbers to represent them in government. And if these elected leaders do not govern in a way that the community finds agreeable, well, they can be replaced. So by establishing representative assemblies instead of appointing a dictator or a governor, they are again learning to practice democratic problem solving. And they are starting to learn that if they are going to pay taxes, those taxes ought to be levied by an elected leader who they can hold accountable. We're going to jump forward about 13 years now, and we're going to talk about the Plymouth colony. So in 1620, we get a second group of settlers who are going to arrive in modern-day Massachusetts. But I do want you to understand a few things about these particular settlers. So first, unlike the settlers in Jamestown, they're not coming over as representatives of a company seeking to exploit resources. They're coming over to live permanently for the rest of their lives. And they're doing this in large part because of religious differences that they have between themselves on the one hand and the Anglican Church, the Church of Britain, on the other hand. These individuals were religious separatists. And what that meant was that they were Christians, but that they felt that the Christian church of their country had become so corrupt that they needed to break off and create their own version of Christian society. And they decide that the best way to go about recreating society according to their own Christian beliefs would be to separate themselves from Europe altogether, travel across the Atlantic Ocean, and settle in North America. But I don't want you to get the wrong idea. They did not necessarily want to separate themselves from British governance altogether. They did want to be able to run their day-to-day life according to their own Christian beliefs and customs, but they were very, very concerned about living in a state of anarchy. In fact, the plan was originally to land in Northern Virginia so that they could borrow from the local law and order already established in the Jamestown area under the authority of the British Crown. But instead, they get blown off course and they arrive in the area that today we call Massachusetts. And so they're faced with a dilemma, because they don't have enough resources to follow the coast southward until they arrive in the Chesapeake Bay area, but they don't want to step foot on dry land until they've established some system of governance. Because while they're on the decks of their ships, they're under maritime law, and there is a clear chain of command. The captains of each ship are in charge. But as soon as they step foot on dry land, there is no clear order of authority, and then they would at that point be in a state of nature, in a state of anarchy, and they're afraid of that. So before ever stepping foot on dry land, they agree that they're going to assemble together on the deck of their flagship, the Mayflower. And so that's what they do. And while they're on the deck of the Mayflower, they begin discussing how things are going to be run once they have established their new home in Massachusetts. And what they're ultimately going to do on the deck is sign a historical document known as the Mayflower Compact. Now, the Mayflower Compact is sometimes characterized as America's first constitution, but that's not entirely accurate. It's not really long enough to constitute a real constitution, because a constitution, understand, is a framework of government, and it takes time to detail how a government is going to run. Well, the Mayflower Compact is honestly only about a paragraph long. You're going to read the entire thing as a part of our one-page assessment for this week. So what is the Mayflower Compact? Why are we talking about it? And what makes it so significant? Well, the Mayflower Compact is a historical example of what we refer to as a social contract. A social contract is an implicit or explicit agreement among the members of a society to cooperate under some sort of centralized authority for social benefits. So, social contract theory stipulates that the only form of legitimate government is government by the consent of the governed. In other words, the Mayflower Compact is significant because it shows us that a social contract can actually work in practice. It shows us that the consent of the governed is a legitimate functional basis for government authority. See, if you lived over in London, you had to obey the British Crown. And you had to obey the Crown because, according to the customs of the time, the Crown had a divine right to rule. So, authority of government came not from the consent of the governed, but from God himself. And what that meant was that a monarch was not really answerable to the people over whom he ruled. But if, as we see in Massachusetts, government is created by the consent of the governed, and if the reason I have to follow the rules of my government is simply that I signed an agreement stipulating that I would do so, the Mayflower Compact, then government derives its authority to make rules from the consent of the governed. And here's the funny thing about consent. It can be withdrawn. So if government gets its authority from the consent of the governed, then the basis of power is the people. And that's what we're going to find people starting to believe beginning in Plymouth. In Plymouth, we start to develop our belief in social contract theory, our idea that the only legitimate form of government is government by the consent of the governed. So, the first reason that the Mayflower Compact is significant is that it provides a real-world example of the social contract functioning as a legitimate basis for government authority. The second reason that the Mayflower Compact is so important is that it serves as an opportunity for our early ancestors to develop their political acumen, their ability to draft political documents, and to create prototypes for future documents. The Mayflower Compact is going to inspire a number of other historical documents that we're going to talk about before the end of the week, including the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the United States Constitution, which we will discuss in greater depth next week. So, at this point, we have our values of local sovereignty and independence, of representative government, of government by the consent of the governed, and we have begun to develop our capacity for self-governance. However, we're not done yet, because over the next 100 years, we're going to get 11 more colonies. And this is going to culminate in 1732 with the final of the 13 original colonies, Georgia. But during this time, this more than 100-year time span, we're going to continue developing and reinforcing our own ways of life. Because throughout the colonial history between 1607 and 1732, what we're going to find is that the British Crown more or less leaves us alone. It's content to let us make our own rules governing day-to-day life as long as it continues to turn a profit from the goods that we transport back to Europe and sell to the markets there. But we are not going to exercise our independence to create governments that are identical to those that we see in Europe. We're going to develop our own way of life, our own unique customs, our own systems of government. And as we're doing so, we are once again becoming accustomed to getting left alone, to our own local independence. We are once again developing our experience in self-governance, and therefore we are becoming less dependent on the statesmen of the British Empire. But at the same time, we're going to use this independence and this political experience to begin creating a system of limited government. Limited government is one of the core constitutional concepts that we're going to elaborate on next week. But for now, what I want you to understand is that the colonists are going to exercise their authority to create laws to create rules for the rule makers. In other words, they are going to limit the powers of their governments by doing things like drafting what we call the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. The Massachusetts Body of Liberties secured basic freedoms for the people of Massachusetts and prohibited the government from violating those freedoms. By creating and protecting legally recognized individual liberties, however, the colonists in Massachusetts and elsewhere are essentially establishing a precedent which stipulates that the people can make rules for the government. If I tell you that you have a freedom of speech, that means that the government is not allowed to censor that speech. So by doing things like establishing protections for individual liberties, the people are actually limiting the types of thing their government is allowed to do. And monarchs in Europe don't like this idea that the governed can tell their government what to do. In Europe, the opposite is true. So that's what's going to be happening for the first century and a half of our nation's pre-revolution history. And during this time, things work relatively well because, again, we're being more or less left alone as long as we continue to turn a profit for the crown. And we continue to turn a profit for the crown. But you probably understand that we are no longer British subjects, so obviously something has changed. Well, what happened? To answer this question, we need to talk a little bit more about some history, and we're going to go back to the French and Indian War, which was waged between 1754 and 1763. During the French and Indian War, we have a territorial struggle between the French and their Indian allies on one side, the British and their Indian allies on the other side. And this war is significant for our purposes because in order to protect the British colonists in North America, the Crown is forced to levy a new army and then to send this army across the ocean to fight a protracted conflict with the French. At the end of this protracted conflict, it's discovered that sending troops all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, supplying them, paying them, keeping them properly equipped, it's all very expensive. And so at the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, the Crown discovers that it's not only bankrupt, but it's horribly in debt. And it needs to raise revenue to pay back some of its wartime loans. Well, how do governments raise revenue? Well, by levying taxes. So that's what the British government's going to do. But the Parliament, all the way back in London, decides that since the primary beneficiaries of the French and Indian War were the British colonists in North America, those colonists should have to help pay back some share of the costs accrued. And so some of these taxes, though not all, are going to be targeting the colonies in North America. Now, I do want you to understand that these taxes were not arbitrarily implemented. The reason that taxes targeting the colonies in North America were levied by Parliament and the British Crown at this particular time was that these taxes were going to pay for the costs of protecting those colonies. That's not a faultless argument, but it is a decent justification if ever there was one. And these taxes, you should understand, were not particularly onerous. In fact, the tax burden of British subjects living in North America at this time was actually substantially lighter than the tax burden of British subjects in most other parts of the empire. So why were the colonists so angry about these taxes if they were fairly well justified and fairly modest? Well, remember what we discussed on the preceding slide. At this point, the colonists were accustomed to local sovereignty, independent governance, and representative lawmaking, and they had been practicing this system of local representative governance for over a century and a half now. So why are they upset? Well, because they feel that their independence is being threatened. They are used to getting left alone, and that's not happening anymore. It's not that they hate taxes per se. In fact, they were, of course, levying taxes on themselves all the time. What upset them was that these taxes were being levied by a parliament within which they had no representation and within which the members were very unfamiliar with the local wants, needs, and interests that people experienced on the ground level from Virginia to Massachusetts to Georgia. And therefore, what we're going to find is that the real reason that the colonists were upset was that they had developed a way of life which they felt was being threatened. For this reason, the American Revolution is often, though not always, characterized as a conservative revolution. Now understand that when I say it was a conservative revolution, I don't mean that it was a right-wing revolution. I don't mean that it was a Republican revolution. What I mean was that it was a revolution fought to conserve a way of life that people had already become accustomed to. You can contrast this with a liberal revolution like the French Revolution, which was a fight to create a whole new system of governance, a whole new way of life that the people of France had never before experienced. So the Americans began to resist the British taxes, not because they hated taxes on principle, but because they felt that if they were going to pay taxes, if they were going to follow government laws, those laws and those taxes should be made locally by representative assemblies, subject to certain laws and limitations. That's not what was happening, and so what we see is the Stamp Act Congress. In 1765, one of the new taxes that the British government created to help pay for the costs of the French and Indian War that ended 2 years earlier was the Stamp Act. Now, you don't need to know the details of the Stamp Act, but basically it created a new regulation requiring professionals to purchase taxed stamps in order to certify certain legal documents. And the colonists didn't like this for the reasons we described before. So they called together a meeting of leaders from across the 13 independent colonies to discuss how they should respond. And these colonists agreed that they would get together with their respective communities and they would organize a series of boycotts of the types of goods that they were required by the Stamp Act to purchase stamps for. And these boycotts were important for a number of reasons, but we're going to focus on two. So the first reason that I want you to understand the boycotts were important was quite simply that they worked. The boycotts called for by the Stamp Act Congress actually succeeded in getting the Stamp Act repealed within about a year of their initiation, and this emboldened the colonists. So the boycotts were significant because their success emboldened the colonists by showing them that when they worked together, they could in fact defeat the British Empire and get what they wanted. And that's actually a pretty decent segue into our second point. The second reason why these boycotts were so significant was that we saw for the first time these 13 independent colonies, these 13 distinct communities cooperating and developing a sense of unity. Up to this point, they were all British, sure, but a person in Virginia had no more in common with a person in Massachusetts than a person in Georgia might have had with a Canadian, or that I would have with a Canadian today. I'm an American citizen. A Canadian is a Canadian citizen. We both have European origins, but we are distinct nationalities not unified by any shared identity. Well, the same was true of the colonists from across each of these 13 colonies. And so when we see these distinct communities working together, that's important. That's where we begin to develop a sense of kinship and unity with one another. But despite this early success, the problem isn't resolved. After the Stamp Act is repealed, the Crown becomes rather irritable. It starts to see the American colonists as an unruly child, unwilling to follow the rules of our father, the king. And so, to reassert its authority, a new tax is implemented on tea. In 1773, we get the Tea Act. And again, it creates a fairly modest tax, but it creates a modest tax on a product that is a household staple. Basically, everybody drank tea. Tea was, at this time, the most prevalent import of the colonists. And so even though this tax was kept very low, it was hitting essentially every home across the 13 colonies. That wasn't a mistake. That was the British Crown flexing its muscles, asserting its authority, reminding every single household who was actually in charge. And remember, because we had become accustomed to running our own business, we liked to think that we were in charge. We didn't like this meddling, and so people get upset. And what we're going to have is another reaction that will continue to escalate this cycle of action and response. We get the Boston Tea Party. At the Boston Tea Party, a fringe group of radicals, known as the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, gets together and disguises its members as Native Americans. These disguised patriots then seize a British ship and dump its cargo of tea into the Boston harbor before vanishing into the horizon. Now, this is important for a number of reasons, but before I explain those, I do want you to understand one thing. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty did not at this time have popular support for their actions. Even among their fellow colonists, popular opinion was still very strongly bent against rebellion. Most of the colonists at this time were still proud, loyal British subjects, and they didn't want to start a revolution. They didn't think that they could win such a conflict, and even if they could, it wasn't desirable. They liked being a part of the empire. They were loyal to the king and to the parliament back in London. However, these radicals, while a minority, were very clever. And by disguising themselves as Native Americans, they hoped that they could bait the British Crown into implementing a system of collective punishment, which would turn popular opinion against maintaining ties with the British Empire. So, in other words, the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, these were radicals who, well before anyone else was on board, wanted a revolution. Recognizing that they didn't have popular support, they orchestrated the Boston Tea Party to bait the Crown into overreacting, with the hopes that such an overreaction would turn the other colonists against the Crown and make it easier to start a revolutionary war. And as it turns out, this plan worked pretty well because the Crown takes the bait. It's unable to identify the specific perpetrators of the Boston Tea Party because, remember, they were disguised. And so it utilizes a system of collective punishment and a series of new taxes and abridgments of local sovereignty that become collectively called the Intolerable Acts. Now, you'll get the details on the Intolerable Acts that you need from this week's reading. But what I want you to understand here is that once again, we see an escalating cycle of action and reaction. The Intolerable Acts, by further abrogating local sovereignty, by further challenging our independence, are going to cause the general public to become increasingly disgruntled. So something clearly has to be done because things are escalating. And to decide what's going to be done, how we're going to respond to these intolerable acts, we get the First Continental Congress of 1744. Now again, remember, we're not a unified nation and we do not have any form of federal government. We have 13 distinct communities, each of which is independent of every other colony. So the first Congress was not a federal legislative body. It was a meeting. The term Congress really just means meeting. Who was meeting? Well, every different colony sent its own group or delegation. And the particular people who served in a delegation just sort of depended on who was the most prominent politician of the time in that particular place. So various leaders from across the 13 colonies get together in 1744 to discuss how we should respond to the Intolerable Acts. And they come to two important decisions. Decision number one. The 13 colonies would each begin to maintain its own militia. Decision number two. In order to arm these militiamen, each of the colonies would also begin stockpiling its own supply of arms and munitions. Now, you're probably thinking that this is clearly an attempt to gear up for revolution. And that's definitely how the Crown interpreted it. But it's not entirely accurate, because it is important to understand that at the time, 1744, virtually none of the delegates, none of the Continental leaders were ready for a revolution. They still didn't think it was feasible, and they still didn't think it was desirable. So they're still proud and loyal British subjects, but what you need to understand is that they are attempting to develop the means to protect themselves from foreign aggressors, because all of these problems originated with that French and Indian War. During the French and Indian War, they were incapable of protecting themselves, so they had to ask the Crown to help them, which it did. But then the Crown wanted them to pay it back for that protection. And so the First Continental Congress is an attempt by the colonists to say, okay, look, if the cost of your protection is a loss of our local sovereignty, then we will protect ourselves and you won't have to worry about sending any more soldiers. Problem solved. But as I've already told you, that's not how the Crown will see it. The Crown sees this as an act of open rebellion. The Crown sees this as the colonists getting ready to declare independence. And so the Crown is once again going to make a miscalculation. It's once again going to overreact. And in this case, it's going to overreact by sending a whole new army over to North America. But remember, that's what caused the problem to begin with, because sending armies across the Atlantic Ocean in the 18th century was really expensive. And once they got there, maintaining that army, keeping them housed and sheltered, was really expensive. So in order to minimize costs, the Crown decides that it's going to start quartering soldiers in the houses of private civilians. Redcoats could show up to the house of any colonist and demand that they be fed and given a place to sleep for the night, and the colonists were not allowed to say no. People didn't like this. It was very intrusive. Furthermore, in order to cover the cost of transporting these troops and keeping them outfitted with proper munitions and equipment, the Crown implements new taxes, which once again, the people don't like. So things escalate. And then we get the Second Continental Congress. By the time of the Second Continental Congress, we're going to find that there are fights already breaking out in the streets. In the First Continental Congress, nobody was really prepared for any form of revolution. But there were some voices calling for that type of escalation at the Second Continental Congress in 1775, only a year later. So what's happening here? Well, first, I do want you to understand that while there is fighting in the streets at this point, we're not in open rebellion. And that while there are some people, like Thomas Paine, who are urging the other delegates to declare independence, they're a minority. Most are still trying to hold out with the hopes that we can find a negotiated resolution. And so they make one final last-ditch effort to find a diplomatic solution to our disagreements, and we're going to call this the Olive Branch Petition. The Olive Branch Petition is sent by the Second Continental Congress to the British Crown, and it does a couple of things. First, it reasserts the British identity of the colonists, and therefore the fealty that they owe to the British Crown. In other words, the first reason that the Olive Branch Petition is significant is that it reasserts the loyalty of the British colonists in North America to their empire and the king that rules over that empire. But at the same time, it invites the king to negotiate on the particulars of their new taxes and trade regulations. And the Crown is so irritated and fed up at this point that it simply rejects this fairly modest request whole hog. And it tells the colonists no. The King, George, basically says, look, nowhere else in the entire empire do our subjects get to negotiate on their taxes. I say jump, you say how high. Get in line like everybody else. This is not a democracy. This is a kingship, and you will do what I tell you because I'm the papa and you're my children. Well, that turns out to be yet another miscalculation. Because by rejecting the Olive Branch Petition, King George proves to the colonists that no negotiated resolution is possible, and that if they therefore want to preserve this way of life to which they have become so attached, they have to be prepared to fight. And that's what they're going to do. After the Continental Congress, fails with the Olive Branch Petition. Thomas Paine publishes his pamphlet, Common Sense, and within a year, July 4th, 1776, Thomas Jefferson drafts a document that today we call the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Declaration of Independence isn't going to be formally adopted for a few more days, but it is drafted on July 4th, 1776. And while it was a resolution rather than a legally binding document, it's still historically significant in at least two critical ways. First, the Declaration of Independence signals our legitimacy abroad. By affixing their names to the Declaration of Independence, the founding fathers of our country were sending a message to the rest of the world that this was no longer an issue of domestic unrest within the British Empire, but rather a full-on fight for independence, a legitimate cause by one people to resist the oppression and leadership of another. And so that's going to play a very important role in convincing the French to get involved on our behalf. And it is the assistance of the French during the Revolution which empowers us and enables us to actually win in our struggle with what at that time was the mightiest naval force and human empire in the world. So the Declaration of Independence signals our legitimacy abroad, thereby helping us to court foreign assistance and win the revolution. The second reason why the Declaration of Independence was so significant, even though it was not legally binding, was that it signaled our legitimacy at home. See, at this point, there were still a large number of loyalists. There were still a large number of colonists who were either dedicated to preserving the empire's integrity or who just didn't know quite where to fall. And the Declaration of Independence is basically going to call for independence, yes, but then it's going to justify that decision, justify the cause by appealing to all of those values that I discussed in the form of 27 grievances. So the Declaration of Independence lists 27 ways in which the British Crown had violated these principles and systems of governance that we now held so near and dear to our hearts. It describes various ways in which King George has abrogated local independence, representative government, limited government, so on and so forth. And thereby it helps to make a philosophical case convincing many that revolution was the appropriate course of action and that fighting for independence would put them on the right side of history. Okay, so now we've gone through the history leading up to the American Revolution. Now we've got full-on war. That's great. We're not going to talk too much about the American Revolution, though, because this isn't a history course. I do want you to understand that during the Revolution, however, we did recognize that there was a need for some form of federal government in order to coordinate our war effort. The colonists had learned through the Stamp Act and their subsequent boycotts that they needed to work together if they wanted to accomplish their goals, and that if they did work together, they could see some success. But they, in this, were recognizing that if this became a free-for-all, each community making its own resistance independent of every other community, they were going to lose. If they wanted to win, they needed some form of federal authority to coordinate the efforts of these 13 independent states. And yes, at this point, we are talking about states, not colonies. So what did they do? Well, they drafted a form of federal government using what today we know as the Articles of Confederation. You can think of the Articles of Confederation as our first constitution, as a proto-constitution. And the Articles of Confederation basically created a federal government for our country, but a very, very limited one. Remember, the idea here isn't to surrender individual or local sovereignty, but rather to create a system by which we can coordinate in our effort to gain independence. So the form of government created by the Articles of Confederation that were ratified in the early 1780s was basically equipped with all of the powers that it needed to fight a war with Great Britain, and that's it. It could handle foreign diplomacy. It could build a military, but it was not really very well prepared to govern a country during peacetime. And so pretty quickly after the American Revolution, we're going to start to see some cracks forming in this foundation. The Articles of Confederation were, in many respects, a success because they were created, again, to help coordinate our war effort, and lo and behold, they achieved that goal. We won the revolution. We are an independent country. But the problems became very evident after the American Revolution, and many of them had to deal with taxes. Because under the Articles of Confederation, the government, the federal authority of our country, lacked certain powers. And one of the powers that it lacked was the ability to levy direct federal taxes. During the Articles of Confederation, states could levy taxes on their respective citizens, but if the federal government needed money, it could only request that the states send that money by levying taxes locally. So it would sign what's called a requisition, telling the states, we need X amount of money. Please use your local authority to implement taxes on your citizens so that you can raise some portion of this money, and then each of you will send us your portion, and we will use that money to do things like pay our soldiers. Well, this system of voluntary taxation worked all right during the American Revolution when the British were breathing down everybody's throats, but as soon as this obvious immediate threat had departed, the states were no longer really willing to voluntarily pay taxes to the federal government. They had accrued their own debts during the war, and they turned their interests inward. So that money dried up. And within a year of declaring victory, we had to disband our military because we couldn't afford to pay our soldiers because the states were no longer voluntarily contributing the funds necessary to do so. We therefore became a newborn nation with no armed forces. And that's very, very quickly going to culminate into a problem, because another issue that we observed at this time was that the federal government could not regulate interstate commerce. And so to pay back their war debts, the individual states not only refused to continue sending money to the federal government, they also began implementing tariffs against one another. If you don't know, a tariff is a tax on any goods crossing your border. And so what we're starting to see is that if two bordering states are going to have any form of trade, then the owners of the goods being transported across the borders of these states are going to have to pay special taxes. And what that means is that transporting goods from, say, Pennsylvania all the way up to Massachusetts becomes very expensive, because you've got to pay a new tariff every time you go from one state to the next. And so by the time a farmer, for example, was able to get his product from Pennsylvania to its markets in Massachusetts, or worse, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean in France, well, he had spent more money in taxes and tariffs than he was going to earn. Farmers could no longer afford to transport their goods, and our economy began to collapse. Well, this is also a problem. Why? Well, these farmers, unable to transport their goods, are forced to basically take loans in order to keep running their plantations. But that's an issue because they can't afford to transport their goods, which means they can't generate the revenue necessary to pay back those loans. So the banks that they borrowed from are now faced with a problem because they've lent out a whole bunch of money and nobody's paying them back. The banks then turn to the government and ask it to enforce their loan contracts by compelling these farmers to pay back the money, which of course the farmers can't do. So the government takes these indebted farmers and it throws them in what we call debtors' prisons, where they're basically locked up and told that they have to stay in jail until such time as they've paid back everything they owe. Because they did, of course, agree to pay this money back, and they have, of course, failed to do so. But this is obviously an unfair situation, because if you're locked up, you're clearly not able to engage in any form of labor to generate revenue. And if you can't generate revenue, you're never going to be able to pay back your taxes. The farmers were understandably disgruntled, and so many of them got together under the leadership of a Revolutionary War veteran by the name of Daniel Shays, and they seized a federal courthouse to keep it from foreclosing on their loans. And that shouldn't really have been a problem because they weren't a particularly large, well-organized, or well-equipped, or even well-trained group. They were an undisciplined mob of poorly armed farmers and shouldn't have been any match for our military. Except that we didn't have a military. Because remember what I just told you. After the Revolution, unable to levy taxes, the federal government had to disband our army. So it takes time before anything can really happen, before the states are able to raise their own ad hoc militias and crush Shays' rebellion. Eventually that does happen, but not before the damage is done. Because at this point, what we've seen are a group of poor people standing up for themselves against a moneyed interest, the banks and bankers. And what that means is that the wealthy of our country become very concerned that our government is not strong enough to protect their interests if the poor decide to, mob together and refuse to pay back their loans. And when rich people are frightened, of course, something is usually done about it. So because of the federal government's inability to regulate interstate commerce or levy direct federal taxes, we have the incident of Shays' Rebellion, and Shays' Rebellion stokes fears that the federal government isn't strong enough. This in turn calls for a constitutional convention, and that's what's ultimately going to happen not too long thereafter. So we get a constitutional convention, and again, it's going to be called to discuss ways in which we can shore up the weaknesses of the Articles. Originally, the Constitutional Convention was a meeting of 55 delegates from the 13 individual states who were supposed to get together and discuss some ways in which they could amend the Articles of Confederation in order to make the federal government strong enough to handle day-to-day business. But they ultimately decide that the Articles are unworkable, and so instead of amending the Articles of Confederation, they toss them out and they draft a whole new system of government, the Articles that would today be our Constitution, with some notable amendments. So we get a whole new charter of government that's going to come out of the Constitutional Convention. But one thing that I want you to understand about our Constitution is that it's, at the end of the day, a negotiated document. Because the 55 delegates who attended the Constitutional Convention came from 13 different states. And each of these states had its own set of unique wants, needs, and interests. Sometimes these wants, needs, and interests aligned, but more often than not, there were conflicts where certain states, say the small states, wanted X, whereas other states, say the large states, wanted Y. And what that meant was that all of these different politicians with their own sets of ideas about what our new government should look like and how it should operate had to compete with one another. And the end result was a document that none of them were completely satisfied with. They had to compromise. There was some give and some take where they made sacrifices and they had a great deal of give and take. Again, nobody was completely satisfied, but everybody was at least happy enough with the document that they were willing to put their name on it. But that didn't come, again, without a great deal of compromise, and there are some very important compromises that I want you to be familiar with because they're going to help you understand future lectures. So the first major compromise that we're going to talk about is the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise was a compromise between two proposals: the New Jersey Plan, put forward by the small states, and the Virginia Plan, put forward by the big states. So what we're going to see right off the bat is that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention have organized themselves into two factions. The first faction is made up of delegates from small states. The second faction is made up of delegates from big states. The delegates from the big states proposed the Virginia Plan. So what is the Virginia Plan, and what are we dealing with? What are we arguing about right now? Well, at the Constitutional Convention, it was agreed quite quickly that we needed a federal legislature, a Congress that could make laws which would apply across the entire country. But what we wanted to figure out at this point was how we could go about deciding how many votes each state got in Congress when it was time for that federal legislator to do things like make decisions about what laws would be passed and what laws would be failed. The Articles of Confederation had a system of equal representation for the states, where each state, regardless of its population, would send the same number of delegates, and each state, regardless of its population, would get the same number of votes. And that tended to advantage the smaller states, because even though there were fewer people living in the smaller states, there were more small states than there were big states, and so the small states had a perpetual advantage. They were able to control essentially all of the laws that passed or failed at the federal level, and the big states were dissatisfied for obvious reasons. So they proposed a Virginia plan. Virginia is a big state, which basically said that the number of votes each state gets in the federal Congress when it was time to decide whether to pass or fail a new law would be proportional to that state's population. If a state with 10 people got 1 vote, then a state with 100 people should get 10 votes. If a state with 1 person gets 1 vote, a state with 10 people gets 10 votes, so on and so forth. However, this plan wasn't going to get anywhere because, remember, the small states outnumber the big states, and they're not going to agree to this because if we had gone with the Virginia plan, then the big states would have had a perpetual majority in Congress, and therefore the only laws that would have passed in Congress would have been those laws that benefited the big states, and small states never would have been able to get any laws passed that benefited them. So the small states refused to pass the Virginia plan, and they proposed an alternative, the New Jersey plan. The New Jersey plan, New Jersey is a small state, said that we should stay true to the Articles and continue giving equal representation to the states. So, New Jersey plan, equal representation to the states. Virginia plan, equal representation to the people within the states. Neither side's going to accept the other side's proposal. So what do? We compromise, and this gives us what is called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. Connecticut, you will note, is a sort of medium-sized state. It's not as small as New Jersey, but it's not as big as Virginia. And the Connecticut or Great Compromise basically stipulates that since the small states won't accept the Virginia plan and the big states won't accept the New Jersey plan, we're going to combine the two. We will have a bicameral legislature. That is a legislature with 2 chambers. The upper chamber will be what we call the Senate. And in the Senate, we're going to use the New Jersey plan. So we will give equal representation to the states. This is true even now in the modern world. Today, every state, regardless of its population, gets exactly 2 senators, 2 votes on whether to pass or fail a bill in the United States Senate. However, we're also going to have a House of Representatives, the lower chamber of our bicameral Congress. And the House of Representatives is going to follow the Virginia plan. The Virginia plan, remember, said that we will have proportional representation for each state based on the number of people living in that state. So today, big states have lots of members or votes in the House of Representatives, whereas small states don't have quite so many. In the Senate, California, with its population of about 45 million, is going to get 2 members. In the House, however, it's going to get 45 members. Oklahoma, we get 2 members in the Senate, but we only have 5 representatives in the House. So the Great Compromise allows us to make certain that we've got a House of Representatives to protect the wants, needs, and interests of large states, and a Senate to protect the wants, needs, and interests of small states. And this way we can ensure that any laws which pass must have something to offer both to small rural people and large urbanized areas. If they don't, they will not manage to pass both states. So it's a bit of a masterstroke, and it helps to keep the small states and the large states united, and it helps us to move forward. But it doesn't resolve every argument. In fact, it opens up some new arguments, because remember, the Great Compromise stipulates that the House of Representatives will provide proportional representation to each state. So states with more people get more representatives and more votes in the House at the federal level. But now we have to decide who counts as a person for the purpose of representation in the United States House. And that's going to be a problem because remember, at this time, a substantial portion of our nation's population is going to be made up of slaves. And these slaves are mainly going to live in southern states. So if the first set of factions that we are going to see are the big states versus the small states, the second set of factions that we're going to see are going to be the states with lots of slaves, the southern states, versus the states with fewer slaves, the northern states. And the southern states are going to argue that slaves should count as a part of their population for the purpose of deciding how many representatives they get to send to the United States House. Now, do keep in mind that they don't want to let these slaves vote, obviously, but they do want to count them as a part of their population because doing so will inflate the number of votes that they get in the United States House of Representatives. The big states tell them you can't have your cake and eat it too. These northern states that don't have all that many slaves basically say that we ought not count the slaves since they can't vote. The states with few slaves are telling us that slaves are property, not persons, and that they therefore shouldn't count towards the population, whereas the states with lots of slaves are saying, well, they are property, but they're also persons, so they should. The slave state proposal is to count all the slaves. The free state proposal is to count none of the slaves. The compromise is what we call the 3/5 compromise, and it says we're going to count some of the slaves. 3 out of every 5 slaves will be counted as a part of a state's population for the purpose of deciding how much representation that state should get in the federal legislature. And this is a part of our Constitution. Now, it's obviously void. It's not really relevant anymore because we're ultimately going to abolish slavery with the 13th Amendment, but that language is still there. And so perhaps this is an illustration of the dark side of compromise. But it's not the only slave-related compromise that we have to talk about. We're also going to find a compromise in Article 1, Section 9. Because at this time, there was a major debate about how our country should handle the Atlantic slave trade. Now, there wasn't much discussion about abolishing slavery at the Constitutional Convention. That would come later. But there was a great deal of discussion about abolishing the Atlantic slave trade. And a part of this was ethical, because the Atlantic slave trade was horrendously inhumane. And if you want to get a very visceral illustration of that, I would recommend that you watch the movie Amistad. But really, this came down to money. Like most things in history, it had to do with money. Because importing slaves from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean into the United States was very much in the economic interest of plantation owners who dominated in the economies of the slave states and who were therefore overrepresented in the political class in the group of delegates that those states sent to the Constitutional Convention. They wanted to protect the Atlantic slave trade, and that was not something accepted by the states that didn't have as many slaves. Now, again, that's not because the states with fewer slaves were unracist. Everyone in that room was a racist. You have to understand that. However, in the states with fewer slaves, they had a manufacturing economy, and for the most part, it was found to be cheaper for an employer to hire a number of low-wage white workers than to invest in buying a slave. But if the Atlantic slave trade was allowed to continue, the number of slaves in North America would increase, and that would drive down the cost of purchasing one. If slaves became more affordable because they were more numerous, then the concern among white voters was that factory owners would begin firing their white workers to purchase a slave who would provide free labor. So really what this comes down to is economic competition. States with lots of slaves wanted to protect the Atlantic slave trade because that was in their economic best interest. States with fewer slaves and market economies based around manufacturing, well, They wanted to ban the Atlantic slave trade, not because it was inhumane, but because doing so would serve their economic best interest. And since we're dealing with people's pocketbooks, there's no real satisfactory resolution to this disagreement. We get another compromise, and not even a particularly solid compromise, because in this compromise, we get Article 1, Section 9, which delays the debate until 1808. Basically, Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says we are not going to ban the Atlantic slave trade now, but we will have this discussion again in a few years. And ultimately, we will have that discussion again. And ultimately, under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, we are going to ban the Atlantic slave trade. But that's not going to happen for at least a couple of decades because of this compromise. So for a couple of decades, the Atlantic slave trade had constitutional protection, and that's a problem. Once again, we see the dark side of compromise. But that's not the last compromise we're going to see. There's one more compromise, and in order to understand this compromise, we need to talk about the last set of key factions present at the Constitutional Convention. So yes, it's true that the delegates there separated themselves into those from big states competing with those from small states. And yes, it's true that they also separated themselves into those from states with lots of slaves and those from states with fewer slaves. But they also separated themselves into a group of people called the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Because at the end of the Constitutional Convention, we basically had the main body of the Constitution. The main body of the Constitution is going to be made up of several different articles, and these articles are going to provide a pretty solid outline or framework explaining what the federal government will look like. But notably missing from the main body of the Constitution are the individual rights and liberties that these citizens would enjoy. There aren't that many limits placed on the federal government in the 7 articles that constitute its main body and that were written at the Constitutional Convention. So what that would mean is that if we ratified the Constitution as written, we would have a very, very, very strong federal government, and we would not have very many protections, rights, or liberties secured either for individuals or their local state-level governments. The Federalists were made up primarily of wealthy individuals like Hamilton, and these wealthy individuals wanted a strong federal government so that they could use it to protect their interests from the poor if the poor decided that they would get together and do something like what Daniel Shays did. So the Federalists wanted to ratify the Constitution as written without any changes being made, so that they could strengthen the federal government to protect the rich against the poor. The Anti-Federalists were, on the other hand, less well off, and they tended to represent the poorer groups in our society, especially the sorts of farmers that made up Daniel Shays' little militia. And so the Anti-Federalists didn't want to ratify the Constitution. They wanted to keep the Articles of Confederation intact, and they wanted this because they preferred strong state-level government to an unlimited or centralized federal authority, which could be mobilized by the rich to oppress the poor. Well, once again, we're going to have to resolve this with a compromise. The Federalists are wealthy, and they want a strong federal government. The Anti-Federalists are less wealthy, and they want a strong state-level government, but a weak federal government. The Federalists say amend the Constitution as is. The Anti-Federalists say do not accept the Constitution at all. What do they do instead? Well, they have a meeting where the Anti-Federalists get together with the Federalists, most notably Madison, and the Anti-Federalists agree that if Madison and his compatriots will agree to draft a series of amendments securing individual liberties and limiting the power of the federal government, they will agree to ratify the Constitution. So that's what happens. The Anti-Federalists vote to ratify the Constitution, and in exchange, the Federalists draft a series of amendments, and they agree to ratify those. The amendments drafted by the Federalists today are called the Bill of Rights. These are the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, and this was the final compromise. The anti-federalists got their Bill of Rights, the Federalists got their Constitution, and we got the system of government that we know and love to this very day. So that brings us to an end of our lecture for week 2. Thanks for bearing with me. I know this one was a little bit longer, but I hope that you found it beneficial. Bye.